One of my other favorite speakers we've ever had on the program is Lily Sedaghat, and she traces plastic pollution around the globe. Started with an individual personal story. I won't steal her thunder on talking about exactly what that is, but I'm so excited to have Lily here with us, and you guys are in for a real treat again. Lily, thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, thanks for being a part of our Women Blaze Trails Festival. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for your team's hard work in putting this incredible package of people together. It's really inspiring.
It's been so exciting so far. Again, we've traveled across the globe. I think 22 countries we broadcast from at this point, which is wild. We were just up in the canopy in Costa Rica about an hour ago, which is really exciting. So it's a tough act to follow, but if anyone can do it, you can. I'm so excited to dive in with your presentation today.
Thank you so much. Should I just get shared into it then?
Yeah, head into it. Let's do this thing.
All right, awesome. Let's do this. Okay. Just let me know. Is it sharing now?
It's sharing now. In the moment, you're perfect. You're full screen. If you want to get rid of that little banner on the bottom that says StreamYard, you're
there. We go. Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us on day 3 of an amazing festival. My name is Lillygol, or Lily Sedaghat, and I am a National Geographic explorer and storyteller who follows the journey of plastic. This entire series of talks that you've been listening to and tuning in the last couple days and today on Valentine's Day, so thank you for joining us, has a lot to do with really passionate people who feel compelled by something or some force in the world to go out there and understand it. And in the act of understanding it, allow us to be connected to this world that we call home. So today, I want to talk to you about plastic and how that connection to this entity allowed me to understand the world, the systems we're a part of, the people who are on the front lines of combating waste, and this process we have as both people and consumers and just individuals out there in the world to understand our connection to ourselves and to our planet through different mediums. So I want to take you on a story with me through Taiwan, through India, through Bangladesh, as we track plastic as it moves through different communities, how it's used in different ways and perceived in different ways, and ultimately what value it has in our lives so that we can think about how we can change it as we move forward into the future. So why plastic? Well, I really love Taiwanese milk tea. I grew up in San Diego, California, and down the street from my father's apartment was a Taiwanese tea house. And I used to go there almost every day after school, and it became like a second home to me. And each time I would order a large iced milk tea, sometimes with boba, sometimes no boba. And I would get that because the feeling of drinking it was so sweet and nostalgic. I would sit in this same orange chair facing the same window inside this tea house and literally became a VIP because I would go there almost every day after school. And in fact, I wrote my first love letter there. I studied for the SATs there. And when I graduated from college, I went back to the same tea house, sat in that same orange chair facing the same window to ask myself that post-graduation quintessential question. What am I going to do with my life? You see, in that moment, I was surrounded by all these questions. And as I reached for my milk tea, I hesitated because in that moment, it was the first time that I saw the plastic cup and the first time that I saw the plastic straw. And I turned around to the trash can behind me, and it was filled to the brim with single-use plastic cups and straws. And I realized that all these years of consuming this thing that made me so happy and feel good about sweetness and taste, that I was ultimately, in consuming the thing that I loved, also harming the environment that I loved. That I was complicit in this out of sight, out of mind process where we take things, consume them, and throw them away, and take things, consume them, and throw them away. And that's just what we did culturally. And we would expect that every day we would come back, that trash can would be empty and that thing would disappear and we can continue to consume. It was almost an unconscious behavior that I suddenly realized in that moment that contributed to this global waste problem, because our Earth is a closed system. Nothing truly ever disappears. It goes somewhere, affects someone or something. So when I had this realization and I knew that this tea and both the cups and the straws came from this place called Taiwan, I knew I had to travel across the world, over 7,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, to this place to understand this international plastic supply chain that connected me and my hometown to this island. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Taiwan, it's an island located off the southeastern coast of China. It was formed by the collision of the Eurasian and Philippine plates. 2/3 of it is covered in mountain. 90% of the 23.8 million population lives on the western rolling plains. It's constantly racked by earthquakes and typhoons. They have to import about 70% of their energy and 80% of their food. And yet, they are considered to be one of the world's geniuses of recycling, with their capital city of Taipei having a 55% recycling rate. So when I thought about how this was possible, I realized that in order to understand plastic, in order to understand its story and its journey and the way it plays a role in our life, we have to understand how it's managed, the waste management system. And in Taiwan, they have a very unique system. So you have this thing called mandatory waste separation in your home. So before you can throw anything away, you have to separate it into 3 different categories. One are your recyclables, which in fact have 33 different subcategories. 2 is your kitchen waste that's separated into wet waste and dry waste that goes towards pig feeds and compost in this kind of circular movement of resources. And then the 3rd category is the stuff that you would incinerate. And because they're an island, they don't have a lot of room for landfill, so a lot of things end up getting incinerated if you can't reuse them. And the way this system works is that their major cities will charge people to buy government-mandated plastic, but trash bags, right? Also made of plastic. And the idea is you pay for your waste in weight. But both recycling and composting are free. So it's trying to incentivize people to use less things that you ultimately end up burning and use things that can be reused throughout their life cycle. And the way that this system came to be, the story behind this entire system, was that a group of moms, housewives, got together and they were sick and tired of their kids walking through trash to get to school every day. You see, in the 1970s and 80s, Taiwan was actually known as Garbage Island, and its economy had grown over the last decades, and it grown so much that people were starting to consume more and more things were trying to be produced, but there was no formal waste management system. So when the island transitioned from almost 4 decades of martial law to a democracy, these moms got together and formed the first environmental advocacy group. And they got together and created this system of separation that you see today. And in fact, their hard work and advocacy wanted to make sure their kids could get to school without having to walk over trash or walk through trash and have a system in place. They did much more than that. They also piloted the first composting program where they went to the government and they said, hey, we've got 900 families in this community who are willingly separating their food waste and everything else, and we're putting it into a garden as compost. Why don't we take this and scale it up so that the city itself can do this? And in their act of perseverance and demonstrating that people were willing to do this and that they could do it, they took it on. The government took it on, and it became this mandated part of the system you see today. They also banned Styrofoam from the food and beverage industry. Styrofoam, as I'm sure you all know, are those, when it degrades, it leaves these little dots, and those are things that you can't recycle. It's not recyclable. So they banned it from the food and beverage industry, and then they also moved to the next step of banning single-use disposable plastics from both public schools and public offices, again, to really connect people to the earth, because to them, nature was an extension of their family. So when we think about what happens when it's managed, the next step we think about is what happens to plastic after it gets recycled or thrown away. And in Taiwan, they have a very unique series of systems. They have 40 to 60% of these individual private recyclers who then take things and send them to different corporations who do really interesting things with it. So for example,
once they separate from the cap and the ring, because the cap and the ring are PE material, but the bottle is polyester. So they separate each, and then also separate from the color. So that's why in the back you can see they are already separate.
So what you have here is a group of volunteers. Many of the people working on the front lines of waste management in Taiwan are elderly people. 50, 60, 70, 80. I met someone who was 101 years old, working 8 hours a day in a recycling facility, volunteering their time to separate bottles and pull out the tape that you have and tape recorders to separate these different materials. And in this process of separating colored from clear plastic bottles, snipping off the plastic rings, using the bottle caps, you can do something with these. They don't have to just be thrown away. And in this system and process, you can take bottle caps and melt them down, squish them, and they become these little tiles. And these tiles themselves could then be used as a form of architecture, interior design. This is promoted by an engineering organization called MiniWiz, based out of Taipei. That same group of women who would then sort those plastic bottles, you rinse them, you wash them, you melt them down into fibers, and they were able to make blankets here on the left-hand side that they then donated to victims of Hurricane Harvey when the hurricane hit in Texas several years ago. You could use those same fibers and create solar-powered backpacks and solar-powered hats, literally modern-day spy gear out of the things that we would normally just throw away. The same company, MiniWiz, took over 1.5 million plastic bottles to create one of the first architectural buildings in the world and composed entirely of the recyclable materials. It's earthquake-proof, it's typhoon-proof, it's a really good insulator, and it demonstrates the power of what we can do when we reconceive these notions of what something is to what it can be. In Taoyuan, you had a company that would import the plastic waste from the United States and other places. And they would take things like Tide bottles and milk tea caps, milk tea jars, the same things that I would get my milk tea in, those cups and straws, and they would melt them down into recyclable urinals. No joke, this is a urinal made entirely out of 100% the milk tea cups that you would then melt down, put into a frame, and you have an LED screen that you can look at when you're peeing. It's incredible, the capacity of innovation when you can take something and think, what can it become? What can I do with this thing? Versus simply just throwing it away. But as the journey continues, we realize that, plastic is something that affects everybody's life, irrespective of where you are in the world, in what community, in what socioeconomic group, your life is touched by plastic in some way. And in fact, National Geographic in 2019 decided to understand and fill in a data gap of how plastic ends up into the marine environment and become marine debris, a lot of the plastic pollution you see. So we realized that plastic flows through land, through communities, through water, to ultimately end up into our oceans. Again, because the planet is one closed circular system. So what we did on this expedition is we got a team of international scientists from 5 different countries to travel up the Ganges River, starting in the bottom right here at the Bay of Bengal, going up through 10 different communities to the summit of the Himalayas, up 2,525 kilometers, to understand how plastic flows through these systems and ultimately, again, ends up into the marine environment. And so our team actually had 3 particular sub-teams. And the reason we chose this iconic river, the Ganga River, as it's known locally, Mother Ganga, is in fact, it is one of the most iconic and culturally significant and spiritually significant rivers in the world. It supports over 600 million people who use and live off the river water for irrigation, for agriculture. Hundreds of millions of people bathe in its waters every single day because the belief is that by bathing in Mother Ganga's water, your sins will be washed away. It is also a conduit for some of the most incredible biodiversity in that region. That river contains otters and dolphins and crocodiles and an amazing assortment of birds and fish. And yet, historically, it has also been used as a waste management system, as water has tendency to just ferry things away. So what you see are remnants of human waste, industrial pollution, plastic. So it is this conduit of life in so many different capacities. So to understand this connectivity the river had to different communities, to land and to sea, we decided to split up into 3 different major teams. We had our water team, a land team, and a socioeconomic team. And what we did in these different teams was to compound different types of methodologies to understand how plastic flows through this system. So in this case, we caught air samples to understand, are there microplastics floating in the air in these different communities? How different communities working in terms of water, we would get together every single day, go out and take samples from the sediment, from the water itself to track the microplastics in the water, to see what's in the bottom of the river, what was affecting fish. We also did this thing where we dropped drift cards. Drift cards look like little plastic bottles, but in fact are made 100% out of wood. And on one side they had Hindi, on the other side they had Bengali, and each of them had a certain tag on it. And the idea was we would drop them in different locations, and anyone who would see one could then read the card itself and be a part of a citizen science experiment, where you could text in where the location is of this particular coded block. And we could understand by people's help, how does these things move through communities? How do they move through waterways? And where do they end up? And a different type of experiment, similar but different, is we actually had a team that focused particularly on building these plastic water bottles. Inside were GPS and SIM cards, and they were tracking devices. So every hour they would ping their location. And we dropped 12 in different areas of the river, with the idea of understanding how a plastic bottle moves through this waterway system. And in understanding where it goes, where it gets stuck, how it moves, we could then help create policy on where can we target where these things are affecting communities the most. Do they ultimately end up in the sea? And in the open deep sea, where do they go? And finally, I was part of the land team. So our team was creating these litter profiles, essentially tracking what litter was on the ground in different communities with the help of those communities, and using an app called the Marine Debris Tracker to understand what ends up on the ground that ultimately gets ferried into the water. We also had a socioeconomic team that worked with local communities. We went into places, we would talk to people, ask them, what do you use? How do you use it? Are there alternatives for you? Are they affordable for you or not? We would have focus group discussions with fishers, with women, with children, to understand their perceptions and also usage of plastic, and where the barriers of access are to minimizing single use. Ultimately, plastic is used in many, many different ways in many different communities. In India and Bangladesh in particular, we would see these places, and we'd go into these marketplaces, and they would have single-use sachets. Single-use sachets, these teeny little plastic things that had soap, conditioner, shampoo, candy, snacks, and ultimately many of those things, tobacco, we would find on the ground that would ultimately end up into these litter profiles and wish their way into the waterways. So understanding how people use plastic, what it means, how it's perceived is really critical. And ultimately, I think it's really important to recognize that in this act of using and this act of figuring out how to live in the world today, we're all just trying to live and to adapt in the act of living. This was a group of children who lived on one of the largest landfills in Rishikesh, and they would jump over plastic bags and broken bottles, and they were just being kids being kids, having fun, and using this thing that people would use to throw away as trash as their playground. So this idea of innovation, this idea of just this act of living, how plastic touches all of our lives, is just so critical in understanding how we want to move forward with reducing plastic pollution in the future, and by understanding our relationship to it. So finally, when we're trying to bring it back full circle to those folks who live in the United States, to those folks who live in other countries, back to where you come from and where you live and how you live, ultimately, understanding the journey of plastic and plastic pollution has very much to do with understanding how do we perceive it? How do we use it? How do we value it? What value does it have in our lives? And when we can do that close series of examinations of what do I consume? Why do I consume it? And how do I manage it? And where does it go? We start asking these questions that allow us to realize that, in fact, we are a part of this magnificent system called Earth that connects us to hundreds of millions of people and multiple different systems and multiple different creatures and environments and ecosystems. And plastic is actually this conduit that connects all those things together, for good or for bad. So when we try to think about how we can minimize our plastic usage, how do we have a less significant impact on those particular ecosystems, environments, or communities, we have to assess how we use it, why we use it, what are our own barriers to access, And in a time like COVID, what does plastic mean to us? Is it a form of protection? Is it a form of safety? And if we start asking those social questions that underpin our use, then we can really think and take the next steps on how we can transform our relationship to that thing to have a safer and more sustainable planet moving forward into the future. And with that, I want to thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you very much.
Lily, that was amazing. As always, so nice to share that story. Again, it's quite the international journey and quite the poetry behind it. So really appreciate the chance to host you and to hear from you today. As does our audience. We've got people tuning in from Taiwan, from Kenya, from across the US and more. So an international audience to hear this message today. Again, for our audience, you guys couldn't have had a better opportunity to spend a lunch hour with us over Valentine's Day. So thank you so much for ignoring your loved ones or sitting with them watching our festival today. We've got some great questions over the next few minutes. So we've got Fallon wants to know, Fallon identifies correctly the fact that a lot of recycling programs, you hear about the fact that you go to recycle it and it ends up in a landfill anyway. How do you start up an effective recycling program in your own community? It's a big question, but is there a lesson you can share with us from what you've learned internationally?
Absolutely. That is such a great question. And everything comes down to value, value, value. Okay. So the reason why certain things don't end up getting recycled and end up going into the landfill is because they don't have value in the market. I think a lot of people think of recycling as just like this entity where, yeah, I'm just going to recycle it and it's going to become something and I'm doing my part for the environment. But in fact, recycling is a business. So everything that we use and we consume that we then want to recycle, that product then has to be cleaned, washed very vigorously, melted down, the polymers shrink in the process. You have to add more stuff so it becomes something of value that somebody would want to use and then to buy as a secondary market. If you think about going to a shop and you have your choice of getting something that's brand new and cheap and clean, or you have something that's recycled that may be a little more expensive, you have to realize that you as a consumer are contributing to the idea of value for that product. So when we're trying to think of how can we create recycling systems that actually work, we have to think about how do we infuse value into that thing. Generally speaking, plastic water bottles that are the number one PET are considered to be the most valuable because they're the easiest to turn things into other things. But a lot of it has to do with how these things make money, but also how they can be considered valuable in terms of us as a community, what we value. So you should do an assessment in your community of what do people consume? Why do they consume it? And then ask the waste management systems, why don't they recycle those things? What part of it doesn't necessitate the value? Is it that recycling community or the waste management infrastructure doesn't have the money for the machinery that can break apart those kinds of materials? Is there no market for those types of materials? There's everything that underpins it has to do with value. So if you can understand why those don't exist and how that fits into your community, then you can think of a solution on how you actually can get those things to end up not in landfills, but in other more valuable ways.
I think that's a beautiful big picture answer. So hopefully that answers your question, Colin. Great question. So Habe wants to know, what effect did it have on you personally when you saw what they were doing in Taiwan? I mean, this is quite the story. 100-year-old people that are volunteering their time to recycle things. That must be very impactful. What did that lead to for you?
I think it has everything to do with purpose. I think we as human beings go through many different stages of life, and we're constantly in search of purpose. What gets us out of bed in the morning? What makes us feel like we've contributed to someone or something today? And when I saw those people like spending their time in a community, like doing these things and working with discarded items that people would just throw away, I realized that the reason they're doing it is because, one, it gives them a sense of purpose. It allows them to connect to their community and gives them value in terms of that their life has meaning by protecting the environment, by protecting the community, by moving things out of landfill and potentially into the ocean that would then go into recycling and then creating new opportunities. So the impact it had on me that was the strongest effect was that this was an opportunity that gave people purpose and value and meaning in their lives. And if we can take that feeling and manifest that feeling into the things we use and how we use them, that everything we have and we do has a purpose, then I think we'd have a very different relationship to our things and a very different relationship to each other and our world.
That is a beautiful answer, and not only an answer for that question, but covers a lot of the other ones that came in on YouTube in the last minute as well. Lillygol, this is great. One thing I always like to ask personally at the end of any broadcast on public or plastic pollution is, what can people do? I mean, individually, right now, if they're not necessarily inclined to lead to a big system-wide change, if they leave this broadcast, they want to, I want to prevent plastic ending up in the environment today. What can I do at home? And are there some examples of things that you've done personally as a result of everything you've discovered?
Yes, absolutely. So there are a couple of things you can do starting today. One, first and foremost, is you got to understand what you consume. So I always recommend that people for 1 week keep a waste journal and tick down every single thing you throw away, what it is, what form it is. And then after that week, go back and look at that piece of paper and ask yourself, how can I make adjustments to these things so that I can minimize my waste footprint? And if I can't, and I don't have access to those, don't have access to those things, there are barriers in place. Who are the people that I can talk to try and change those things for me? That's the first thing. The second thing is always wash your recyclables. Never throw anything into the recycling bin that has like food residue or liquid residue, right? It's really important that you wash them so it has a chance of being recycled even better. 3 is understanding that recycling only really works when you separate materials. So like a coffee cup that has paper on the outside, you put hot coffee in it, actually has a thin layer of plastic inside of it. So to recycle it, you have to separate those materials. So what that means is you got to understand the capacity of your local community's waste management system and industry. Do they have the machines to be able to do that? What values to them? So starting to ask questions of like, how does your neighborhood get rid of trash? How does your school get rid of trash? How does your city get rid of trash? Open yourself to asking those questions and learning more. And then of course, like try to do your part to minimize the amount of things that you consume. So bamboo utensils, bringing that with you wherever you go, or usable water bottle. I understand it's very difficult right now, considering COVID, for us to do those kinds of things. But then how do we innovate and think about within our community? How do we stay safe? How do we also protect the environment? And I think also too, like anytime you see a piece of trash on the ground, like pick it up and throw it away. Otherwise it's going to go and it's going to harm something or some way. So like everyone has the capacity to do something. And I think the act of the journey of an individual through this magnificent thing called life is figuring out how you personally can contribute and in what capacity and what way. And that answer is ultimately up to you.
What a beautiful message to end our broadcast on. Lily, this has been so much fun. It's always a pleasure having you on. I can't wait for you to come back on in June. We do oceans anytime. In the meantime, if you want to tell this story to a whole horde of kids, we'd love to have you. It's what we're all about. But I really appreciate you taking some time out of your Sunday to be part of our Women's Fest. This has been such a fun time.
Thank you all so much for joining us together. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone, and stay safe and healthy.
Fantastic.